Hello, noble ones, and welcome to Metatrons Academy. Today, I would like to talk about the concept of gendered languages in the sense of the grammatical function, that is, gender, how it works, why it develops, how ancient it is, and why sometimes it disappears. Let's go. First and foremost, let's begin with definition. From Britannica, we read, gender in language, a phenomenon in which the words of a certain part of speech, usually nouns, require the agreement or concord through grammatical markings or inflection of various other words related to them in a sentence. In a language that exhibits gender, two or more classes of nouns control variations in words of other parts of speech, typically pronouns and adjectives and sometimes verbs. These other words maintain constant meaning but vary in form according to the class of the word that controls them in a given situation. In this definition already we see that generally speaking, whenever there is a differentiation in gender of a word, it's a noun. But that's not just the case. Like, for instance, there are plenty of languages that will inflect or conjugate either with prefixes or suffixes their adjectives too. And, of course, verbs. All of this can have a gendered grammatical function. Now, oftentimes, whenever we look at examples, linguistically speaking, to kind of demonstrate this concept, either we use obvious ones, so a boy, un ragazzo in Italian, obviously it's going to be masculine in gender because the boy is a male, and then ragazza, a girl, feminine, that's the obvious one. Other times, it becomes less obvious when you try and connect that to items and everyday inanimate objects. For instance, this phone in Italian is masculine, il telefono. It's a boy phone. And it doesn't really matter if you change the color and make it pink, not to mention pink wasn't really a feminine color before the 50s, but perhaps we'll make a video about that before. It was quite masculine before that. But regardless, even if this was turned into full of hearts and Barbie, it would still be masculine because a phone is masculine. On the other hand, the chair I'm sitting on is feminine, la sedia. This can be strange from the perspective of people who don't speak gendered languages, for example, English or Anglophone speakers. But here is a way to look at it. Sometimes in English you do it too. It's rare and usually not necessarily grammatically connected, but it is a thing. For example, when you refer to a ship or a sword as a she. But depending on the language this extends, here is an interesting example. Look at these. If we look at this map, what we're looking at is countries. Now, the difference is that the ones that you see represented in green are those countries that have a name that is masculine in French, whereas the purple ones have a feminine name. Now, not only this may appear arbitrary, why the heck is Spain and Italy feminine, but Portugal is male? Interestingly enough, that's the same in Italian. America, for instance, is feminine, but if you say the United States, the states are masculine. But this is not always the same in every language. So, here is the same concept, but it's in Polish. Now, this is interesting because not only we see that it differs, but there are multiple colors now. We don't only have two, so what happened? Well, blue is masculine, red is feminine, green have like some kind of specific exceptions, like the idea of in plural it will change gender. This happens a lot actually in languages that have gendered names sometimes. Not a lot, but it does happen quite a bit. And then yellow, they don't have a gender, if you will. Now, sometimes there are grammatical ways to recognize or sort of patterns, if you will, like if a word finishes with a letter, then usually will be feminine, or usually you could expect it to be masculine, but that's not always the case, and there are always plenty of exceptions to this rule. And once again, do remember that, for example, the sea in Italian, il mare, is masculine, but in French, la mer is feminine. Not sure about Spanish. Let me know in the comments. For interest, here is a list. This is a list of languages that do not have a grammatical gender. And you see, of course, you have within the Afro-Asiatic with Hausa, and then lots of languages. A lot of Asian languages don't have that differentiation, for instance. But then, and here is the list of masculine and feminine, so languages that have these two. Of course, we do have quite a lot, particularly when we enter the Indo-European sphere. Italian. Boom. Isn't it interesting that we can read there is a trace of the neuter because we don't have it anymore in some nouns and personal pronouns? Example, singular uovo, the egg, dito, the finger, plural, they become feminine. Yeah, absolutely. It says, although singulars of the type dito and uovo and their agreements coincide in form with masculine grammatical gender, and the plurals conform to feminine grammatical morphology. Yeah, exactly. You know, I have my own theory when it comes to that. Personally, as a native speaker, because there is also that I wanted to give you the perspective of a native speaker, because sometimes when we look at this, and if you come from a language that doesn't have gender, oftentimes you might think, but does it have any feel to it? Or do you just use it as a rule? Like, is it just a colorless rule that brings nothing with it? And the reality is no, it's a bit of both. So we don't think about it too much when we speak a gendered language every day. Like thinking that my headphones are feminine, I don't really think it when I say it. It's just normal. That's how it sounds. So there is a sound correctness to it. It's what I expect it to sound. But other times it does have functions, like the idea of using it, taking the same word and changing the gender slightly changes the meaning. So if you say il tavolo, in Italian it means the table, and it's masculine. It's just a general term, noun, to mean table. It can be all sorts of different types. But if you say la tavola, usually it's in connection to food and eating. And so it is slightly different, if you will. In that case, both are available, but they don't mean the exact same thing. But again, continuing with the idea of gendered language. Yes, in the way we use it every day, I don't think about it too much. I don't think that a pen is a woman and a floppy disk is a male. What I do get, however, is a inner distinction that probably it's inside my psyche and at the subconscious level. Because if I were to animate these objects, most likely I would make this into a cartoon of a little boy with a voice, and then the pen would be a girl. It's not always the case, but I'm saying if I didn't have time to think and I had to imagine animating any object, probably I would do it in concord with their gender, which means there must be some residual connection, at least in the back of our head, with femininity and masculinity, even though sometimes you wouldn't expect it. Believe it or not, sometimes this can be extremely random. There are words while probably the most used words for the sex organs are masculine for the masculine one and feminine for the female one, opposite versions exist too. So you can use a word to talk about a woman's vagina, but the word is masculine. And it's fine. Like it doesn't matter that much. That's why I'm saying, I know it won't make sense to you, but I'm saying sometimes it's just the way it is and it doesn't really matter that much. But other times it does have a little bit of an internal connection to it, but it's not always the case. As I say, it's a case-by-case scenario. And it sometimes does defy logics. In those cases, I think it's more of a grammatical function then. But here is my theory that I wanted to share with you. I personally think that gender, at least in Italian, but I suspect that's the same in Portuguese, French, and Spanish, is not necessarily connected to the end of a word. This is what the vowel. This is what we are usually told. We are told if a word ends with an A, then it's feminine, and if it ends with an O, then it's masculine. I don't think that's where the gendered nature of an object resides. I personally think it resides in the article. And the reason why I say this, but this is just my idea, but the reason why I say this is because you have exceptions. You have exception like la mano, where it's the hand, it ends with an O, but it is feminine, and it uses la. It feels feminine, regardless of the fact that it ends with an O, and in my opinion, is because gender is connected to the article. Just my theory here. So, the phenomenon of grammatical gender is both ancient and deeply tied to the history of Indo-European languages, though it is not unique to them. In a gendered language, nouns are classified into categories: masculine, feminine, and sometimes neuter. This classification affects how other words, adjective, pronouns, articles, sometimes even verbs, must agree with the noun. However, as exemplified before, it's important to note that grammatical gender does not always map directly onto biological sex. Look at the German word for girl, which is grammatically neuter, not feminine. Now, why do languages have a gender? Thing is, there isn't one simple reason, but there are several interacting explanations. One is classification systems. Early language communities needed ways to group words together, and gender may have begun as a form of noun classification, similar to how some African and Australian languages have noun classes for animate, inanimate, edible, etc. Also, it could be a matter of clarity, as gender provides a way to link words across a sentence. Last but not least, historical chance and analogy. Some linguists argue that gender spread and persisted largely because of analogy and tradition within language families, not necessarily because it served a strict communicative need. Here's the next question. How ancient is gender? Well, difficult to pinpoint, but we can definitely say very ancient. Already in Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor of Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, etc., spoken 4500 to 2500 BC, we had at least two genders originally, animate versus inanimate. Over time, animate split into masculine and feminine, giving rise to the three-way system: masculine, feminine, neuter, which was found in classical languages such as Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. What's interesting is that even other language families, such as Bantu or Algonquian, independently developed elaborate gender-like systems, showing that noun classification is a recurring feature of human language. So, the concept is at least 6,000 years old in our linguistic record, and probably much older. Now, why did it naturally develop? Sometimes it could be considered a cognitive categorization system, an animacy hierarchy, and morphological economy. Once a system of agreement arises, it tends to grow and solidify because it reinforces grammatical patterns. Now, the next question is, having established all of this, why do languages eventually tend to lose gender? Languages often simplify over time, especially when spoken widely by people of different backgrounds. Imagine contact, trade, and conquest. Gender is one of the features that tends to erode because it is sometimes redundant, complex for learners, and vulnerable to sound change. This is what happened, for example, in Old English, where gender distinctions were carried in noun and adjective endings. As English lost many of its inflections due to stress patterns and phonological erosion, the gender system collapsed too. Old English, between the 5th and 11th century, also called Anglo-Saxon, had masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns, like modern German. Over time, endings that marked gender eroded. For instance, unstressed vowels all merged into E. By Middle English, 12th to 15th century, agreement markers disappeared, leaving only natural gender: he, she for people, it for things. This simplification was accelerated by Norse and French influence, as large multilingual populations pushed the language towards a more analytic, less inflected structure. Now, whether or not this trend is going to happen to our currently spoken languages that do have gendered or not is difficult to foresee. It's not universal, but there is indeed a tendency in some language families, particularly in the Indo-European and Western Europe, for gender systems to disappear. English lost gender almost entirely. Scandinavian languages reduced 3 genders to 2 in many dialects. Afrikaans dropped gender from Dutch. However, many languages still maintain or even strengthen gender noun class systems, for instance Slavic languages, Bantu languages, etc. So it's not a one-way street, but a pattern tied to historical contact and simplification case studies. In summary, the gendered system may seem strange, but when you look at it from its linguistic, natural evolution steps, and you look at it from a possible tribal community with their need of categorization and simplification, and possibly speed of communication, then you can see how it evolved, how it strengthened, how it stayed as a form of tradition and what just appeared to be correct the way you speak, and how sometimes, unfortunately I would like to add, it erodes due to possible simplification and outside influence. But let me know what you think. Do you like the gender system in your language if you have it? And if you don't, are you intrigued by it? Or do you think it's just an annoying feature that you wish was gone? But let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for joining Metatrons Academy. Bye.